think, especially since I printed out the text, that hopefully will help people follow along. So I'm Joanne Klein, for anybody who doesn't know me. Everybody knows me. And I'm glad to be back for week 2 of the series of being like God in the primeval narrative of Genesis 1 through 11. So last time we talked about creation and Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 through 3. Today we're going to talk about Cain and Abel, and also the genealogy that follows that in Genesis 5. So part of the story is very familiar, and part of it, maybe after the Cain and Abel, famous part, maybe not as familiar. So that's why I printed out the text of the 2 chapters. Like I said, you can follow along with your Bible or your phone or whatever if you want a different translation. And that's what we'll be looking at today. So let's pray together as we begin. God, thank you for bringing us together again to study your word together, and please help it to bring wisdom. Help us to also get wisdom from each other as we look at these passages together. Again, we remember the violence going on in our world in places like Israel and Palestine, also Ukraine, Haiti, and other places where people are experiencing violence and where brothers are killing brothers. Please bring peace to our world and help us to be agents of that peace. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, just a little recap from last week. So anybody remember a kind of a main point that stuck out to you, or even a question you're left with, or anything just to remind people who were there or who weren't there what we talked about last week in Genesis 1 through 3? That was a long time ago.
Well, we were made in God's image, so there's a certain validity to thinking of being like God, but there's a wrong way of going about it. And God put limits on what we were supposed to do and experience and know. And what it reminded me of actually afterwards was how it said Jesus was in the form of God, but didn't grasp equality with God, or it should be something to be exploited. Like, well, that's exactly what we do. We try to grasp being like God.
Yeah, that's such a good summary and such a good connection to that passage. Thank you, Sandy. Anyone else have a comment from last time? I think Sandy really captured the 2 sides of being like God that I'm trying to get at. That humans are made to be like God. They're made to be God's representatives, made in God's image. And yet when they try to grasp, to go outside the boundaries, to be like God in a way that God didn't make them to be, that's when things go bad. And we saw that happen in Genesis 3 last time, and then today we'll really see some of the outplaying of that and the consequences of that as we go on. So let's just start out by looking at Genesis 4, 1 through 7, just the beginning of the handout as I have there. We'll read it, and I'll talk through some of this language. Let me look at the handout version. All right, so Adam and Eve, just to recap, they've been kicked out of the garden, and God cursed the ground. Remember that God doesn't curse the people, but there are consequences for Adam and Eve for their disobedience. The ground is cursed, and they're kicked out of the garden. Eve gets her name right at the end of that, even after God outlines those consequences. Adam calls his wife Eve, which means living one, because she's the mother of all the living, and that's kind of right at the end of chapter 3. And so now we open on chapter 4. It says, Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Which is kind of an interesting thing to say. So that name Cain is connected with a verb here. It's playing on a verb that is that word produced, is kana. The verbal root is kana. So she says, kaniti, which means I have acquired, I have produced, I've created. It can mean to create. I've created a man with the help of the Lord. So Cain's name is connected with that verb that means either to acquire or to create, basically. His name, that's how it's played on, at least here. other people point to other Semitic cognates and say that, and even in the Bible, there's also a root that's related to Cain that means like to form or to fashion. And so Cain might mean smith, like a metal worker. And that's what we see later with Cain's descendants, the Kenites. They're associated with metalworking and things like that. So Cain's name here is connected with the idea of create or acquire that Eve says, and that's a biblical pattern where often names, people, when they name a child, it's connected with some idea and some concept in the context. It's interesting also that she says, I've created or acquired a man. She doesn't say a baby, a ish. That's the Hebrew word ish. We've seen a couple different words. It's literally with the Lord. The help part that's in the translation here is just an interpretive addition. So I've created a man with the Lord, or I've acquired a man with the Lord. You remember that, if you remember from last week, that word Lord is the divine name, Yahweh, versus if the text says God, it's usually representing the word Elohim, that general word for God. So Lord is that intimate, personal name for God. And interesting to me that even after they've been, taken out of the garden where they had this really intimate relationship with the Lord, still God is really involved. Eve says she's creating a human life with the Lord, with God's help. Interesting, she doesn't say with Adam, even though that's implied in the text, but and also a really important role for Eve, the mother of all the living, that before God is the one who created humans, and now she's the one creating a human with God. So God isn't removed from the process, but Eve, in a way, is this kind of co-creator. And also interesting, it doesn't mention the pain in childbirth, so there is a kind of continuity. God mentioned as part of the consequences that there's going to be pain in childbirth, and so that's part of the consequences. But that's actually not what's focused on here. It's a kind of positive picture that Eve is, at least that what's focused on here. Eve has created a man, produced a man with the Lord. So that's Cain is born, so he's the older brother. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Some ancient interpreters say that they're twins because it doesn't repeat that Adam knew his wife and she conceived and gave birth, but that's probably just not focused on it. Probably not twins, but interesting idea, especially in light of stories like Jacob and Esau. So Abel, you might remember if you were at my Ecclesiastes series some time ago, there's this word hevel that repeats over and over again in Ecclesiastes. That means breath or vapor. That's translated as meaningless or vanity. And hevel is that same word. That's Abel's name. So Abel means vapor or nothingness, something that passes quickly, which is true, tragically, of his life. Although some people connect the word, there's also a Syriac word that means herdsman. That's close to this word. So some people think his name really has more to do with being a herdsman, which would be kind of parallel to Cain as connected with a profession of metalworking, even though that doesn't really come out in this particular narrative. But it does with Cain's descendants. We see Cain's descendants working with metals and things like that as we go on. Anyway, so we have Cain and Abel, and we don't hear anything about their childhoods, but all we hear is Abel was a keeper of sheep, which would be in keeping with that meaning of herdsman, and Cain a tiller of the ground. So some people see this as a conflict between this kind of archetypal conflict between shepherds and farmers, which may have something to it, although there's more than that. All right, so verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. It literally means to look at. The Lord looked at Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted?" This is a really difficult phrase, but it literally says, if you do well, is there not uplift? And it's kind of ambiguous what God is talking about here, but it seems to regard the fallen face. So Cain's face is fallen. If you do well, isn't there some kind of uplift? But if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it, or you can rule over it. The language is really similar to what God says to Eve. Puzzlingly, Jonathan and I were talking about this morning, and it's been hard to know what to make of this connection. But God says to Eve in Genesis 3:16, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Here, God says, sin's desire is for you, but you must rule over it. At the very least, I think we can see a kind of connection between the consequences that played out in Genesis 3 and what's going on right now. I don't think there's a kind of exact parallelism between the kind of items in this, between Genesis 3:16 and 4:7. But at the very least, we can see that God has given Cain a chance to do what's right. God's telling him, sin is crouching at the door. It's this kind of animal image, just like we had, the serpent in the garden. Now it's more like a lion or something image of sin crouching at the door. But Cain can do the right thing. And if he does the right thing, there is uplift for his fallen face. All right, I want to ask a question people have asked since ancient times. Why didn't God have regard for Cain's offering? And I want you first, before talking to me about it, I want you to talk to maybe the people at your table or sitting around you about that question. Why didn't God have regard for Cain's offering? What does that mean? Why did it happen? So talk for just a couple minutes to people sitting near you. You could look back at the text and see if there's any clues. We were hoping to get it projector to work, but still not working, so that's all right. What are some ideas that you came up with? Yes, Bill?
We can't answer. The text doesn't tell us.
So that's a really good answer. The text doesn't tell why God didn't accept the offering. What do you, Ryan?
It's just speculative. Abel offered his offering with humility, and Cain with pride, arrogance.
Yeah, that's a common answer. That's something about Cain's attitude. And do you find any details in the text, or is it just kind of you're just trying to figure it out?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a common answer. But I think there aren't a lot of there aren't details in the text, but it is it's good reasoning to get there. What any other thoughts about why the offering? Yes, Bruce.
It's always seemed to me that Abel gave something irreplaceable, an animal, and its life was sacrificed, whereas Cain brought something that was endlessly renewable, some fruit of the ground. Of course, Meg just asked, what else was he going to bring?
Yeah.
But it does seem like Abel's sacrifice was very costly and irreplaceable.
Yeah.
Except that the mother sheep can have more babies.
Yeah. I think that's another common answer. So one common answer is something about his heart, his attitude, his pride or something. Another common answer is he brought an animal sacrifice versus the plants, and yeah, there's something more valuable about an animal sacrifice. And animal sacrifices are prominent when we get to like the priestly rules in Leviticus, for example, but there's also a place for vegetable offerings as well in at least Israel's sacrificial system. So vegetables do seem like an appropriate offering, especially since, like Meg said, that's his job. He's a farmer, so what else is he going to bring? Yes, that's another common answer. Good, Sandy.
So we talked about how Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground, which is some of the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And Abel gave the firstlings
Yeah.
and their fat portions. So
Right.
it was more special. But when I raised my hand, it wasn't because I had a brilliant answer. It's because my question is,
Yeah.
how did they know that God
Yeah.
accepted Abel and not Cain?
That is a great question. So first of all, yes, that's another detail. This one actually you could point to the text for, that Abel brought the firstlings, the first fruits of his flock and their fat portions. So maybe it has to do not with the animal versus plant, but the quality of the offering. So Cain just brought something, but Abel brought his first fruits, the best stuff of his. I think that has a little bit of merit in the text. On the other hand, it's still a little ambiguous because it says Cain brought the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and it says Abel, when it says for his part in this NRSV, it's Abel also brought the first fruits of his flock. You could read the also as just the idea of an offering. So like Cain brought an offering and also Abel brought an offering. Or you could infer that Cain also brought his first fruits, and Cain brought the first fruits, and Abel also brought the first fruits. So that I think there's something to that idea, that Abel's quality of his offering was better, but I don't think you can see that 100% from the text. It might just be left unsaid that Cain also brought the first fruits, but that's possible. As for how they knew, that is a great question and not answered in the text. I have if you could see my PowerPoint right now, there's an image that I have of a painting representation of this. You can show around where how you know is the fire is coming out of the sky and burning it up. And that's something you see in other biblical texts where the Elijah story, for example, or in Leviticus when they dedicate the temple, that's what happens. Fire comes down from the sky and consumes the offering. So that's how this artist is interpreting it, that fire came down from the sky and consumed it, whereas Cain's was not consumed. But it just doesn't tell us. And I think there's a lot of things that the narrative doesn't tell us. I tend to think that maybe there's something to all these ideas, but I do agree with Bill ultimately that the story doesn't tell us why. We can make guesses about why the offering was accepted or not accepted, but something we see, in Genesis and elsewhere in the Bible is that God makes these choices, especially of a younger sibling over an elder sibling, and it doesn't say why. Sometimes we might kind of see some justification as the narrative plays out in terms of their behavior or their transformation, but is that why God chose them, or is that an effect of God's choosing them? We don't really know. And so I do think that the narrative isn't completely clear about why God chose chose Abel's offering and not Cain's, but the kind of maybe more important point is Cain's responsibility to act in light of that inscrutable situation. That Cain, it's not like God has rejected Cain. God says, you can do the right thing here, and he has a choice. But as we'll see, he chooses the wrong thing. So let's go on and look at verse 8. It says, Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. If you look at the footnote, you can see that let's go out into the field is not in the Hebrew text. It just says, Cain said to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field. So something is missing in the Hebrew text. Either it wasn't there or something fell out, or it's not clear. The let's go into the field is in the Greek, an early ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. So not clear if that's original or just a kind of interpretive addition. We may not ever know what Cain really said to his brother. But Cain said something to his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Very famous line from this story. And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." We might ask who that anyone is. His family, maybe. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And that word Nod is connected to the word wanderer, so it means wandering. So he's a wanderer, and he goes away to wandering place. The wandering place. All right, so as this plays out, there's lots of connections, verbal, thematic connections with what happened in Genesis 3. If you can think back to that, what different connections, maybe words or themes you see and how things are playing out with Cain and what happened with Adam and Eve in chapter 3 in Genesis? Bruce?
Well, God clothed Adam and Eve. God marks Cain.
Yeah. They're both these aspects of God's care and protection, which is really surprising in this case, because Cain's a murderer. Usually, the just punishment for murdering in the Bible is that you are killed. But in this case, God actually prevents that from happening, and God puts this mark of Cain, which is not bad. We think of that as sometimes the mark of Cain as like a curse or something negative, but the mark of Cain is a mark of protection on Cain. We don't know what the mark is or what it looked like, but God is saying if anyone kills Cain, he's going to get this sevenfold vengeance, and so it's a mark of protection. So God protects him, yeah.
Just a quick question. This never gets talked about, but isn't the implication of this story that he's our father, this guy? Because there were only two of them, and one of them's dead at the beginning. So we're all descended from Cain.
Well, there's Seth after that, so we'll
Seth,
see.
That's right.
So Seth is the line that is, as we'll see. So Cain has a genealogy that goes 7 generations that we'll see in a second, and then it's kind of like dead-ended. But there are descendants of Cain. If the Kenites, like I said, seem to be descendants of Cain. So, but the chosen line does seem to go through Seth. So I think it's not necessarily the implication. Right, so we have consequences, but God's care, that's one pattern that repeats here. Anyone see other connections? Or yeah, Becky?
It was the sense of denial.
Yeah, right.
Adam and Eve deny that they've done anything to God
Mm-hmm.
and hide themselves.
Right.
And Cain is denying, in a sense,
Right.
that
Right.
he hasn't done anything.
That same kind of reaction, deflection, denial. God also asks a similar question of Adam in the garden. He says, "Where are you?" Here he says, "Where?" also at the beginning of his question. Where is Abel? And we can ask, well, of course, doesn't God know where Adam is? Doesn't God know where Abel is? But it might be a chance for them to respond, giving them the responsibility to respond and take responsibility, and they both deflect it in a way. Yeah.
There seems to be a vital role for all of God's creation, including the earth.
Yeah.
And there's almost an animate quality to the ground
Yeah.
here
Mm-hmm.
in a way that recalls the significance of the environment in which Adam and Eve lived before the fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And that word ground, Adamah, that's what Adam was taken out of and created. Then the ground is cursed in Genesis 3, and now Cain is cursed from the ground, or in relation to the ground some way, and the ground has swallowed up the blood. So I agree with you. It is this kind of animate reality and a kind of almost a character. Jonathan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that about the comparison of the cursing, like you were both just saying. And yeah, it's interesting that Cain is cursed from the ground. He's not just kind of cursed in curse of mankind or something, but it's like in a limited way.
Yeah, right. It seems to be kind of just in a lot of continuity with the consequence for Adam, that the ground is not going to, you're going to work the ground by the sweat of your brow. And then this is kind of just an upping of that. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to its strength. But also, and then there's another thing, not only the ground, but being a fugitive and a wanderer. So he has, in a way, the same in exile, like Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden in an east direction, because in Genesis 3 it says God put the cherubim in the east to guard the garden. So the implication, I think, is that they're sent to the east. And also here, when Cain settles in verse 16, he goes east of Eden. So obviously the origin of the Steinbeck novel title. East of Eden is negative. That eastward movement has a negative tinge. And if you think about, too, the geography of Israel and where their exile happened to Babylonia, it's a northeasterly direction, but exile is kind of the ultimate punishment in Israel's history, and also an eastward movement, and so kind of a negative one. I also think this is a little bit of maybe an abstraction, but in terms of my theme of being like God, that Cain taking his brother's life is kind of an ultimate example of, going outside the bounds of humans and taking a life. God is the giver of life and creator of life, and in control ultimately of life and death. And so Cain killing his brother, even though the language of like God isn't used here as it was in Genesis 3, this idea that Cain is taking a life is, I think, a kind of example of stepping outside the boundaries that humans are supposed to be in a kind of ultimate way. So I think all these connections can kind of show this backward movement to backward look to Genesis 3, in that, all these things that happened in Genesis 3 of Adam and Eve disobeying God, reaching outside their bounds to be like God, we see all the consequences playing out, and this pattern playing out. Although also the pattern of God's grace and God's close relationship with people continues, even with Cain, which is surprising. But also, so it's looking back at that chapter and showing kind of the playing out of the consequences. But also this story looks forward, looks ahead to the rest of the book of Genesis and this pattern that we see playing out of brother versus brother in Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and in at least two out of three of those cases, the brothers want to kill their brothers, and so the pattern is they set the pattern here that we're going to see. And also God's election, God's choosing of the younger brother over the elder is also set forth here. So this, I think, is kind of this hinge between the Eden story and the rest of the book of Genesis, and showing those consequences playing out, and then how that happens in this repeated pattern throughout the rest of the book. After this, I think we have a little lesser known part of the text starting in verse 17. This is Cain's genealogy. And genealogies, we'll see next time too, they play an important role in terms of kind of structuring the book of Genesis. In a way, there's this alternation between narrative genealogy that kind of marks out units. And we can also trace these kind of more the focused on lines through the genealogies that have dead ends versus the genealogies that continue and get picked up again. So Cain's genealogy it ends up being a dead end genealogy in that it doesn't get picked up again in the next genealogy. But it is important. We have these 7 generations from Cain to Lamech. And so first of all, I won't necessarily read all of this, but so Cain has his wife, and people have always asked in ancient times, where did the wife come from? The common answer, both in ancient times and modern ones, if you're trying to read this in a historical way, is that it had to be his sister, or possibly niece. And you do have these long, hundreds of years lifespans for the people in this time period. So presumably Adam and Eve are having other children that we don't hear about, and there's a wife. I don't know. It does seem like Cain assumes other people are around. He's afraid of wandering around and meeting somebody who's going to kill him. So maybe there are other people around and we just haven't heard about them. Some people, I think John Walton has this idea that more people were created, and he kind of, I think, it could fit in with the evolutionary framework if you wanted to. But that Adam and Eve are kind of representatives of humanity, not literally the only people, but they're special representatives of humanity, but there are other people around. So I don't know where Cain's wife came from. Yeah.
They could be seen as a kind of royalty because they're viceroys
Right.
over all the animals in the earth.
Right.
So if there was a creation of human beings, but they were chosen to be the king and queen, as it were.
Right. Right. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, the narrative does seem to assume other people are around, but doesn't explain where those people would have come from. So I'm not sure, on the level of the narrative, I'm not sure what the author or authors or the tradition meant to be saying by Cain's wife, whether it's just assuming it's his sister or assuming, yeah, there's other people out there. But anyway, he goes and builds a city. This is the first city that's mentioned, and we have this kind of city-garden opposition. When we get later to the Tower of Babel, for example, we have this kind of negative connotation with people coming together to build cities, and in a way, a kind of expression of human hubris, kind of. And so you have this first city that's built by Cain. And then also his descendants are these kind of founders of culture. So we have Lamech. Lamech has these two wives. So Lamech is the first mentioned polygamist. And polygamy is not condemned in the Old Testament. But it is interesting that the first example of polygamy, we have Adam and Eve as a monogamous couple, and then we have this first example of polygamy in the line of Cain, and this very negative character, as we'll see. Lamech is a very negative character. So we have the ancestors. Jabal, he was the ancestor of those who lived in tents and have livestock. His brother's name is Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. And Zillah had Tubal-Cain. Tubal is also related to smithing or metalworking, just like Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. So all these elements of culture, so the livestock, the music, and the tools, we have all these elements of human culture here, and a little bit of a negative shadow on them because they're in the line of Cain. Whereas in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, these things tended to be given to humans by gods or divine figures. These kinds of skills in metalworking and arts and craftsmanship were given by gods. And here, like I said, it's a little bit of a negative cast, and I don't think we want to think of human culture or arts as negative. But perhaps this idea of kind of city building and the negative aspects of human culture, some of the negative aspects of human culture, or just the idea maybe that these are human pursuits and not necessarily like divinely given in a way. But I'm not sure what it's saying exactly about this. And I think Cain's line, Cain is not, like I said, Cain is not totally abandoned by God. God helps him and protects him. But there is, I think, especially when we get to Lamech, a negative, we see kind of this negative conclusion of Cain's line in this picture of Lamech. So we have this little poem that Lamech says to his wives, this boast in verse 23. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man, or could even be a boy, for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. Lamech is avenged 77-fold. So Lamech, we have this kind of the violence of Cain's line, like I said, reaching its full negative picture in Lamech, the seventh generation from Cain. And so Lamech is boasting, either this is kind of a taunt to a rival, or it's something he actually did in the past of killing somebody who, hit him or something. And we have this, I think Lamech is also this example of trying to be like God in a negative way, in that, God is the one who protected Cain and gave him the mark of protection. Now, Lamech compares himself to, in God's place. If Cain is avenged sevenfold by God, then Lamech is avenged 77-fold by himself. He's the one who's going to take 77-fold vengeance on anybody who hurts him. So he's killing people for bruising him. And we might see this as reversed by Jesus. When Jesus is asked, how many times should I forgive Jesus says, 70 times 7, or I think the language is a little bit ambiguous, but something like that. 70 times 7 is how many times you should forgive, versus Lamech, who's avenging himself 77-fold. And so, God, like I said, God has a certain care for Cain. We see his line playing out in kind of all these human endeavors, which aren't necessarily negative, but we do get this very negative picture at the end of his vengeful descendant, Lamech. And then we switch gears in verse 25 and come back to Adam. And so this is the only other child we've seen from Adam. Cain's wife being his sister theory depends on the idea that Adam and Eve had a bunch of kids that we just don't hear about. But Adam knew his wife again, and she bore him a son named Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. And so this word Seth is related to that word appoint. So this is like the appointed one, the one who's set in place of Abel. And it's kind of a kind of replacement, a kind of renewal of that line. And then Seth has this son, Enosh, and it says, at that time people began to call on, invoke the name of the Lord, which it doesn't really explain what that means, that they began to call on the name of the Lord. Obviously, Eve already invoked God's name when she said, I've created a man with the Lord. But perhaps it's some kind of worship, some kind of following God. At the very least, I think there's a contrast between Cain's line, where we don't hear any mention of that, and we get to Lamech, who's this vengeful, murderer, versus the Seth line, where people are calling on the name of the Lord. And then we get to I'll just pause here, see if there's any questions or comments before we go into the genealogy. Jonathan.
Just two small comments as food for thought that are unrelated. One is I was struck by Cain, this is backtracking a little bit toward the beginning, but when it says Eve says, I required a man with the Lord, that verb I had never connected to that word that means to create. And that's like in Genesis 14 when Melchizedek comes, Abraham says, like, I will lift up my hand or swear by God Most High, in the creator of heaven and earth. It says Simru Kune, which is not common, I don't think, and it's basically used of God. So I wonder whether Eve is being pictured, like you said, it's not like I acquired a man or created a man with the help of Adam. I created with Yahweh, and I just wonder if Eve is being presented as like a creator almost. Yeah. But it's like Adam is not.
Right. I mean, it does say Adam knew his wife Eve, so there is like the biological fact is mentioned, that Adam's involvement. Yeah. But that's not what Eve focuses on.
Right.
And I do think it is interesting that if you take that verb kana as being to create, that Eve is a creator like God, and with God, like a co-creator with God.
Right, and it's like she's the ezer, the help.
Yeah.
Which is also a word that's used
mostly of God, almost always of God. Yeah. I think, in my opinion, Eve has gotten kind of a bad rap, and I mean, she's a flawed person, obviously, like we all are. But yeah. So.
What verse is that?
The one.
Are you talking about the Abraham one, or the Melchizedek?
The Abraham
one you were just citing, where he plays this important role.
At the very beginning of Genesis 4:1.
4:1.
Yeah.
Okay. Where she conceives, that word conceived is the one that you're pointing to.
Not that word, where she says, I have produced.
Oh, I have produced. Okay.
So that's the same as when Melchizedek says God is the creator of heaven and earth. That creator word is the same as that produce word. No. Thank you. Did you have another comment?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to time. But I was struck by in verse 25, which we were just reading, when it says, where Eve talks again. She says, God is appointed for me another child. So then it says child, but it's the word descendant, which is really interesting. And I was thinking about the curse on Cain. It's like all the things that are loomed so large in the Old Testament, the blessings of land and descendants and God's presence are put in peril for Adam and Eve and then for Cain.
Yeah.
But it's like Eve is, I wonder if she's focusing on not just like a kid, not just a child, but like I have descendants now.
Right.
I'm going to have that blessing again.
Right. That's a good point, and that descendants thing really becomes the theme of Genesis, or the big question of Genesis as we continue, especially in the narrative, the Abraham stories at chapter 12. God also promises Abraham land, descendants, and blessing. But the descendants one is really what the drama is around in the rest of Genesis. Is Abraham's line going to continue? And it's constantly put into peril because of barrenness, which is connected with this fruitfulness idea, and then sibling rivalry. Are the brothers going to kill each other? Are there going to be descendants? So that is interesting. That and then that Seth is the line that we follow. That line of Seth is the one that gets followed. That's a good point.
Just a quick question about what Jonathan just said. Aren't there a number, like I'm thinking of Hannah and of course the Virgin Mary, but there are a number of instances where a miraculous child is given.
Right.
And it's mysterious, but
Right.
it's like this same renewing of a blessing, even though there's a dead end.
Yeah, that's a great point. It almost seems like if you read the Old Testament that childbirth is almost always miraculous. That there's, of course in the background there's lots of people having children, but the characters that are focused on in Genesis, but you also see it with Hannah, Samson's mom, maybe there's definitely a miraculous element. That idea that God has to intervene in order to have a child. You can see it with the book of Ruth also. It doesn't say Ruth is barren, but Ruth is married for 10 years and she doesn't have kids. She doesn't have a kid until it says God gave conception in chapter 4 when she was married to Boaz. It's almost as if God always has to intervene miraculously for the birth of a child to happen. And so maybe that theme is introduced here. That's a really good point. Bill, were you going to say something?
Well, I'm curious about the second half of verse 26.
Yeah.
What do you make of the fact that at this time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord?
I don't know about that. I mean, like I said, all I can really understand is that it seems to be a positive picture of this line versus the Cain line. Did people, the question of the name of the Lord, it also, like later on in the narrative, like in Exodus, at least according to what some people would see as the priestly source, God's name is only revealed in Moses' time. But yet we do see people using it in earlier times. And so there is a kind of tension between the idea that like God reveals his name in a special way in the context of the Exodus story. But yet you have people invoking the name of the Lord here. It's literally calling on the name of the Lord. I don't know I'm not sure what it means, but like I said, if you contrast that to the end of the Lamech thing, he's trying to, you can see this in terms of the being like God theme, bringing back to my theme, that, Lamech is coming into God's position himself as the avenger, whereas in Seth's line, people are calling on the name of the Lord. They seem to be putting themselves in a righter relationship with God rather than trying to kind of take God's place. Calling on the name of the Lord is having a relationship with God, with Yahweh, but putting themselves in the right relationship instead of taking God's place, like Lamech. Anyone else have a thought on that? What that means, calling on him? Yes.
Is there a question as to whether we're taking this as literal history or more allegorical up until chapter 12 of Genesis? And if literal, are we talking about 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, or could it be 50,000 years ago?
Well, that's a big question. I think there's, especially within Genesis 1 and 2, there's definitely, and we talked about this kind of last time, there's definitely pointers to the idea that this is not meant to be a literal account, especially Genesis 1, the kind of the structure of it, the light and darkness created before the moon and the sun. And I think there's, just on the literary level, there's enough pointing us to the idea that this is not supposed to be telling us like a play-by-play account of how God created the earth. Whether that is different in Genesis 2, with the story of the Garden of Eden, or not. I mean, there's, like I said, different ways of seeing that. You could see it as a literal, creation of God, like Adam and Eve being literally created of God. You could see it, I think it could fit into more of an evolutionary framework if you either see it as, a kind of symbolic story, or as Adam and Eve being literal people, but they're like representatives, like we were talking about, representatives that are of humanity, that are put in the garden. To me, the narratives are so laconic, and they're just terse. There's so many details they don't tell us, and they're not asking those same questions about the age of the earth and history that we might be looking for as moderns. That I prefer to focus on, the theological meaning of it rather than trying to kind of untangle. Is that, how literal is it? How historical is it? But I don't. Maybe you want to weigh in, or go ahead.
Just that the entire scriptural narrative continually goes back to this idea of federal headship, where I have chosen Jacob, but we know Jacob is also the name of an entire people.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so that's true for Moab, that's true
Right.
for all these other names, so why not make it true here?
Right. That it's a literal person, but it's also a representative that's
Right, so
bigger than
these
that.
genealogies
Yeah.
could represent 10,000 years
Right.
instead of 1,000 years.
Right. And genealogies, I don't think there's any way to measure like the time period based on the genealogies, which people have done historically. That's how they get the 4,000 whatever date of the earth, by counting the dates in the genealogies. But we know that ancient genealogies are not comprehensive. We can see that from looking at comparing it with other things. But even in the Bible, comparing genealogies, you can see differences. So there's no way to I don't think, to calculate these events, even if you want to read it literally historically, by just adding up the years that the person lived and counting backwards. I don't think that's the function of the genealogies, which we'll talk a little bit more about next time. All right, let's look at this genealogy for the next 10 minutes or so. So this is a 10-generation genealogy from Adam to Noah. And so we had Cain's genealogy with 7 generations. This one's 10, from Adam to Noah. And so we hear at the beginning some restatement of these themes from Genesis 1. It says, this is the list of descendants of Adam. When God created humans, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and called them humans when they were created. And so just a kind of recap of that picture in Genesis 1 of humans made in God's image. And then we have Adam. Adam lived 130 years. He became the father of a son in his likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. And so we're following the Seth line here, not the Cain line. And interesting that, God is, that Seth is in the image of Adam. And I don't think that that's to say that Seth is not made in the image of God. I think the implication is that the image of God is continuing through normal human reproduction. And when we get to after the flood story, which we'll see next week, God says you shouldn't shed someone's blood because God created humans in the image of God. So the image, it doesn't only apply to Adam and Eve. I think it continues on through their line. So Adam has Seth and other children, and then Seth in verse 6 is the father of Enosh. Enosh is another name for man or humanity. That's kind of often used in poetic text. So Enosh is a name like Adam. Adam means humanity, and Enosh means humanity. And I'm not sure whether it's a kind of positive, like a new start, after the Adam and Eve generation, or the Cain and Abel generation. Now we have a kind of new start with Enosh, new humanity, a new hope. Or perhaps it's more of an emphasis on the frailty of people and here's another human, kind of more of the same kind of thing. Or maybe it's a little of both. And then we won't follow all of these. Needless to say, all these people are living a long time, hundreds of years. Some of the numbers may be symbolic. Are these literal, or are they symbolic ages? We don't really know, but there are similar things in other ancient Near Eastern genealogies. So there's a Sumerian king list that has these these kings that have these tens of thousands of year reigns before the flood. And then after the flood, in that list also, then the Sumerian kings are reigning for shorter and shorter periods of time. And there's also another list somewhat similar of a later Babylonian historian who lists these 10 kings who are reigning before the flood. So there does seem to be a kind of ancient motif about long-lived people, or at least long-lived kings, before the flood, which is another story that has ancient Near Eastern counterparts, which you'll have to wait till next week to hear about. So these people are living a long time. There's 3 more generations, and then we get to Enoch, and that's in verse 18. And Enoch, Enoch is a mysterious figure, so we see in verse 22. So Enoch is the father of Methuselah, the oldest person who lived in this genealogy. And it says, Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him. So very mysterious figure. He's the 7th person and 7th out of 10 in this genealogy. He walked with God, so he has this positive, we can think of, he has this positive relationship with God. And he lived 365 years, which is shorter than anybody else on this list. And then it just says he was not because God took him. And most people have seen this as some kind of, supernatural taking of Enoch to be with God. It also, this kind of language could refer to a natural death, and some people will just interpret it this way, but it's hard to know why that's pointed out. In Second Temple Judaism, Enoch becomes this really important figure. There's a whole body of literature that grows up around Enoch because, and in Second Temple Judaism, there's a convention of pseudepigraphical writing where people are writing under the names of famous figures. There's a lot of literature like that, and so Enoch literature is purported to be written by Enoch, and he's a convenient figure because he was taken by God, so he's with God, and so he becomes this kind of guide into all these secrets of the universe, astrological things. End times, it's eschatological literature, so end times kind of stuff. Also, he gives a lot of details on the situation that we'll read about next time about according to the Enoch literature, these fallen angels who get together with humans and have this race of giants. That's all fleshed out in the Enoch literature a lot more than it is in Genesis 6, which we'll see next week. Anyway, really interesting literature, and even quoted in Jude, if you look in the book of Jude in the New Testament, he says, as Enoch says, and then he has this quote that's right out of First Enoch, basically. But in the actual, canonical Bible, we hardly hear anything about Enoch. Also interesting that he lives for 365 years, the solar year, that people, so for example, at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, that sect seems to have followed a solar calendar versus a lunar calendar of kind of more mainstream Judaism. So they love Enoch as well because he's a kind of solar calendar representative figure. Anyway, that's a kind of story for another time. But very, very mysterious guy who gets taken away, but has this relationship walking with God, which is interesting. And then let's look at Noah. So you notice a lot of the names are similar. So Cain also has a son named Enoch. We also have Lamech as the father of Noah. So you see a lot of similarities between the names of this genealogy and the Cain genealogy, and I don't know what to make of that. Some scholars think there was a kind of common source underlying this that was reworked in 2 different ways. I don't know. Maybe people just happen to have these common names. But Lamech has this son, Noah, and he says, out of the ground, and this is verse 29, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands. So, harking right back to that Genesis 3 curse of the ground, Noah is supposed to bring relief. And this word relief, Naham, it has 2 of the same consonants as Noah, so Noah's name is related to it. And Noah and this root, Naham, are played on this throughout the flood narrative, and we'll see that next week. But Noah is portrayed as kind of a new Adam. So he's the 10th generation from Adam. He's going to bring relief from this curse of the ground that affects Adam. And so we're wondering, what's going to happen with Noah, this new Adam? Is he going to bring the relief of the curse of the ground? And so then the story, as it goes on, will focus on Noah, and that's what we'll see next week with the flood. Any questions or comments here? Yes?
It seems like this is a different view of the work of humans in the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, that this is drudgery versus a call to fruitfulness.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that at all, or am I way off base?
Than what we see in the garden scene, or?
Well, I mean, God gives Cain a mandate, and it's not pretty. But Cain's previous role seemed to be to till the ground and allow it to flourish.
Yeah.
And it seems like Lamech's words to Noah
Yeah.
suggest something about the process of working the ground
Right.
that is negative versus positive and fruitful. That this is work that needs relief.
Yeah.
That is toil versus is fulfilling a call to flourish
Yeah.
amid the creation of the ground and of plants that God has given.
Yeah.
It seems like an odd contrast.
I think it's just that there's two sides of working the land and working the ground that are maybe in tension, in that God has given the land, it's a gift. God has made humans to be in charge of working this land and helping it be fruitful, and it's providing for people. And yet, on the other hand, it's very difficult, and the reality is, and was in the ancient world, it's difficult work, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the ground is barren. Sometimes there's famine. Sometimes, it's like land is a gift, but it's also, a source of frustration and work, and people probably were spending most of their energy working the ground. So I think this is pretty much in continuity. What Lamech is saying is in continuity with this picture we have of the ground, work being difficult and toil being difficult, even though there is a positive aspect in that, God does create this land to be good land for humans, and it's a gift, and that gift of the land is still there even after Adam and Eve leave the garden. So I think there's just those, I don't know, I just see it as a tension between those two things. And it's not really clear, what Lamech means, and how or if this is fulfilled. Some people connect this to Noah after the flood. He plants a vineyard, and so if he's the first person to produce wine, then that's the relief that he's giving people from their work, a way of relieving human labor is through this the wine. I'm not sure what other interpretations would be, but I do think Noah is set up to be, we have this kind of expectation of him as a new Adam and someone who's going to bring something positive. And we'll see next week the kind of mixed results of that. Is that satisfactory? I guess we're out of time, but a lot of these themes we're going to pick up on next time, and the story we'll pick up on next time as we look at Noah and the flood next week, and followed by the Tower of Babel and Genesis 10 and 11 the following week. So thank you everyone for being here. Happy to talk to people afterwards. I'm sorry about the PowerPoint, but thank you for